The First World War was the bloodiest conflict in Canadian history, taking the lives of more than 60,000 Canadians. War was declared on August 4, 1914, and soon after, young men from Orillia and area were marching down Mississauga Street to the train station, on their way to enlist. The war continued until November 11, 1918, the day we now mark as Remembrance Day. So many local people were impacted by this war, the Great War, the war to end all wars. We would like you to meet some of these people.
From the very beginnings of World War I, organizations like the Canadian Red Cross, YMCA, and every imaginable social club, church group, charitable organization, and women's institute mobilized to help the war effort. Simcoe County's home front was soon sending the troops comfort packages that included cocoa, magazines, tobacco, notepaper, handkerchiefs, soap, books, and above all, warm socks. Along with field comforts, Simcoe County also raised funds for the war effort. Collingwood began a campaign to raise $10,000 for the Canadian Patriotic Fund, and relief societies were set up all over Simcoe County to look after families of soldiers. By the end of the war, the Barrie branch of the Red Cross had raised over $62,000 and shipped nearly 305,000 articles overseas. Over the course of the war, the women of Simcoe County knitted 27,154 pairs of socks, many with encouraging notes tucked inside them. Our history, our heritage, our county.
Lance Corporal William Chester Barnes was born on October 10, 1896, in Seabright. Chester, at the age of 20, signed in 1917 with the Aurelia Regiment. Chester was sent to northern France. In September 1918, as a Lance Corporal, he took part in the battle to capture the village of Sancourt. Chester was killed in action on the 1st of October, just 9 days before his 22nd birthday, and only a few weeks before the end of World War I. He was buried in the British cemetery at Sancourt. The cemetery today is surrounded by farmers' fields, a perfect setting for a farm boy from southern Ontario. Sidney Thomas Meering was born on July 16, 1890, in Simcoe County, and was living on Barrie Road in Orillia when he enlisted on March 13, 1916, with the 157th Overseas Expeditionary Force. Sidney saw action in the trenches of France during the Battle of the Somme and was wounded. He was evacuated to the No. 30 Casualty Clearing Station, where he died on June 4, 1917, from a gunshot wound to his right side. He is buried in Aubigny Communal Cemetery in France. Private Thomas Charles Kennard was born on May 26, 1897, in London, England. His father died when Thomas was 4 years old, and his mother had no way to provide for her son. He was sent to Canada at 10 years old as a British home child. Being a home child meant he would have to work on farms as a farmhand at 10 years old until he turned 18. Thomas worked on several farms in Oro. In 1915, when he was 18 years old and no longer had to work on farms, he moved to Orillia to take courses at the McKee Business College. Thomas went overseas on April of 1916. On October 14th, Thomas was taken to a hospital with a gunshot wound in his left side. 10 days later, he was sent back to the trenches. The following year, on April 9, 1917, Thomas was killed in action during the famous Battle of Vimy Ridge. His body was never found. As he has no known grave, his name is inscribed on the Vimy Ridge Memorial. Edward Teddy James Koster was born on January 23, 1890, in London, England. He also came to Canada as a British home child in 1895 at only 5 years old. Teddy went to live with the Anderson family in Orillia. He was treated well by his adopted family. On February 8, 1916, he enlisted with the Grey and Simcoe Foresters Regiment. Teddy was wounded by shrapnel on the Arras front and also suffered a gunshot wound. He got an infection after fighting in the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Exploding shells caused him to lose his hearing. He was discharged from the military in March of 1919 as medically unfit and suffering from shell shock. He returned to work as a plumber and moved to Regina, Saskatchewan, where he married Olive and had 2 daughters, Gladys and Isabella. Teddy Koster died in June of 1950 in Regina and is buried there. Duncan Anderson was born on December 9, 1850, in Glasgow, Scotland, came to Canada and settled in Oro Township. The Andersons had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy named David. David died when he was only 5 years old. A few years later, Duncan and Isabella adopted a British home child. This was Edward Koster. Duncan became mayor of Orillia in 1919 and was mayor until 1921. During that time, he paid to have a plaque made to honor Aurelia's fallen from World War I. The plaque hung in the Opera House for many years, but now is located in front of the Royal Canadian Legion building. Duncan Anderson died in September of 1926. 42 men from the Chippewas of Rama First Nation enlisted in World War I. Private Howard Joe, born in 1900, and his brother Ernest, born in 1897. The brothers enlisted for war together on April 11, 1916. 6 months later, Howard was sent home because of his age. Although tens of thousands of underage soldiers lied their way into service, Howard was unable to. At just 16 years old, he was very small. But he did not give up on his desire to serve his country in the war. 1 year later, he enlisted again, lying about his age. Howard fought in France, at the Battle of Amiens, and several other famous battles. He returned to Canada in 1919. His brother, Ernest, was 19 years old when he enlisted for service. He saw action in France with the 58th Canadian Infantry Battalion. He returned home to Canada on March 20, 1919, later married and lived out his life in Toronto. 4 men from the Saint Germain family and who were from Rama First Nation fought in World War I. 3 were brothers and 1 was a cousin. Brothers Barney, Owen, and John Henry enlisted with the 177th Battalion, Grey and Simcoe Foresters, in April of 1916. Owen was born in 1894 and saw service in England as well. The 3rd brother, John Henry, was born in 1896. He suffered gunshot wounds to the forehead and neck and was sent home. He served in England and France. Their cousin, James Edward, born in 1888, enlisted on April 17, 1916, in Gravenhurst with the 122nd Battalion. He saw action in France and Belgium. Walter Louis was born Wee Hong Louis Chu in British Columbia in 1894. He was the son of Chinese immigrants. Walter was always proud to be a Canadian first and Chinese second. He enlisted for World War I on April 19, 1917. He became part of a unit called the Rocky Mountain Rangers. The battalion spent March and April on the front lines southwest of Arras. He was honorably discharged at the end of the war. He received the British War Medal and the Victory Medal. Walter completed the electrotechnician program in May 1928 at the Milwaukee School of Engineering. Walter moved to Aurelia in the 1930s, hoping to open a store. The town council refused his business license, which Walter thought was because he was Chinese. He packed up his World War I uniform and medals and sent them to the Prime Minister, stating that he had been born in Canada and that he fought bravely in World War I and should be allowed a license. His license was granted, and he operated the West End radio shop on Mississauga Street, right across from the library, for many years. Walter was very active in the community, including playing on the championship curling team in the 1940s. He married but never had children. Walter Louis died in Orillia and is buried in St. Andrew's and St. James Cemetery. Although women didn't officially fight in World War I, many women enlisted as nurses and were stationed very close to the fighting in the trenches and at the front. They were called nursing sisters. The Canadian nursing sisters were nicknamed Bluebirds because of the color of their uniforms, which was light blue. A total of 3,141 nursing sisters served in the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps in World War I. By the end of the war, approximately 45 nursing sisters had lost their lives. Jean Ogilvy Alport Roberts was born in 1886 in Aurelia. She graduated from the School of Nurses, Toronto General Hospital, and enlisted to go overseas on April 7, 1915. Jean was working at the No. 4 Canadian General Hospital in Salonika. When she became very sick with tuberculosis and bronchitis, she was sent to a hospital ship and eventually back to England for hospital care. When her health wasn't improving, she was sent home to Canada, arriving in June 1916. She married Dr. Moses Chesley Roberts in Aurelia on June 6, 1917, and they moved to Regina, Saskatchewan, her husband's hometown. She contracted the flu in 1918 and died on November 3, 1918, at only 32 years old. She is buried in Regina. Margaret Helen Langman was born in 1884 in the township of Oro. She graduated as a nurse from the University of Toronto. Helen enlisted with the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps as a nursing sister on February 2, 1916. She served at the 15th General Hospital in Orpington, Kent, England, tending to wounded soldiers. She returned to Canada in October 1917 on sick leave, but returned to England in February of 1918 to continue caring for the wounded. Suffering from pleurisy and heart trouble, she resigned her post in the fall of 1918 and returned home to Canada. She worked at various jobs throughout her lifetime and passed away at 95 years of age in 1980. While the men of the households had to go off and serve their country, the women had to help out with farm chores as well as running their own households. Some women had to go to work in factories to make ammunition and weapons. As well, many women's organizations began with specific reasons to have meetings, like food canning clubs and making quilts, bandages, and clothing for the soldiers. Along with all the things they made, they would send books and newspapers overseas to the soldiers. They also organized send-off parties when the men left for war, and welcome home parties when they came back home. Harriet Brayley Ego was born in 1873. She married Robert Ego in 1896. Harriet was a member of Jarrett Women's Institute. Women's institutes were organizations based on the idea of establishing a strong female community, providing women with the chance to make a difference in their communities. When World War I began in 1914, services were not in place to feed the men who were enlisting as soldiers. Local people had to organize food and other comfort items quickly to provide for the hundreds of soldiers based in Aurelia and Barrie, as well as those who had already been sent overseas. This quote from Aurelia's newspaper, The Packet, gave credit to one of these people, Harriet Ego. Mrs. Ego of the Jarrett Women's Institute brought in a crate of beautiful strawberries on Saturday, the first gift of fruit for the Simcoe County Canning Kitchen that the government is establishing at Barry under the Women's Institute there. As the Barry kitchen was not ready, the fruit was made into jam in an Orillia home kitchen and will be taken to Barry later for shipment overseas for the use by our Canadian wounded in military hospitals. Harriet continued to support the war effort along with hundreds of others. In fact, during World War I, the women in Simcoe County knitted 27,154 pairs of socks to be sent to the troops in the trenches. Each pair had a note tucked inside showing love and support from home. World War I had an impact on everyone in Aurelia and area, including our grandparents and great-grandparents. We must never forget the sacrifices of the soldiers and their families, lest we forget.